9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Live from Swansea, this is the Twilight Show with Nathan Gynn.
Morida Pab, Croeso Abatawi. Hello and welcome to Swansea in the Twilight Show. We meet Nathan Gynn on Teachers Talk Radio. Tonight we're joined by Sarah Alston, author of Working Effectively with Your Teaching Assistant, a handbook for primary teachers. Managing the vital relationship between teachers and teaching assistants in primary school, whether you're working with an expert or newer teaching assistant. Tune in, talk it out, off we go.
Live from Swansea, this is the Twilight Show with Nathan Gynn on Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live at ttradio.org or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Morida Pab, Croeso Abatawi. Hello everyone, welcome to Swansea. Welcome to the Twilight Show. We meet Nathan Gynn on Teachers Talk Radio. And we have gone through that window of it being the Twilight Show. It's the sunny show, as it is, as we move into the summer term, the summer months. As I said, we're joined by Sarah Alston tonight. I can see she's in the studio there. Sarah, if you can click that call in button, we should be able to connect you so that you can join us. We're talking about her book, Working Effectively with Your Teaching Assistant. Now, I'm going to read a quote off the back here from a previous guest of ours, Andy Taylor. It says, a comprehensive and accessible guide to support anyone in gaining the most from their support staff. I enjoyed the many practical strategies and case studies to support and inspire. Now, I'm just going to check that we've got our guest live with us. Sarah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can indeed. Just to say, it's Sarah, not Sarah.
Terribly sorry there, Sarah. Now, if you wanted to tell us just a little bit about yourself, what you do, kind of your background.
Yeah, I'm one of those. I've been teaching since 1986, which is terrifying. So I'm very mainly primary schools, but I'm also taught in secondary and in special needs unit. I'm still in school, so what I do comes from experience in school. I'm still in school 2.5 days a week as a practicing Senko, still at the chalk face, or probably the interactive whiteboard face. And I do that part-time. The rest of the time, so 2.5 days a week in school, the remaining 8+ because I don't really get work-life balance, an independent consultant and trainer working with schools to support children both in the area of special needs and safeguarding. And, I go into schools, I do, work with schools as doing reviews, and I offer training, and increasingly I write, which I find really quite scary to say because I'm also significantly dyslexic.
Oh, okay. Interesting. That is interesting. I might pick your brains about sort of that process because I want to ask some questions about sort of the structure of the book a little bit later on. But I wanted to start off though asking, we're discussing your book, Working Effectively with Your Teaching Assistant, and there's a couple of caveats, sort of from the title that you address in the preface of the book, and one of them is sort of that, is teaching assistant a good title, a good job title for the staff we're talking about?
Frankly, no. It would not be my choice. It is not the title I use, but it is the title I sort of got lumbered with for the book because it's the most commonly used. It's used by the DFE. And it's a shorthand. I think it was 18 different titles in fairly common use.
Yeah.
To describe these amazing people who work and support our children in schools. My personal choice would be learning support assistant. I think teaching assistant implies that these adults are assisting the teacher. I think the emphasis should be learning support because they're supporting learning.
Yeah, the one that I'm most familiar with, I would say as well, is I generally talk about learning support assistants as well. I've used it, and I think with you, that for me most fitted how I've used that kind of support in my classroom. I've heard them called other things as well, where I've been worried about there being too much expectation on them. Being called things like assistant teachers. Sort of that other way round, and it is kind of about how they're being used. That learning support definitely, and that comes through in the book really strongly. The other part that I wanted to ask you about that kind of comes from that title, and you do address it in the book, is the kind of ownership issue of saying your teaching assistant. I've always been really lucky and felt a kind of co-ownership there between I'm they see me their teacher. We kind of own each other. But do you think there can be a friction between that kind of boss subordinate way between the classroom staff then?
There definitely can be, and I'm very aware of it. But equally, I was trying to sort of get my head around this and say, well, I want to make it clear it's about the relationship. Hang on, if I was writing a book for TAs, how to work effectively with your teacher. And I do address it because I think there is a danger sometimes in hearing teachers talk about their TA as if they're a subordinate, something they own. But equally, people will talk about their partner or their husband or their wife so that it supports the children's learning. And I think one of the things I talk about a lot becomes a myth that the teacher and the TA should be friends. They are, but that's not the purpose of the relationship. That the relationship is to be able to work effectively.
And, I think, that kind of supporting relationships that you talk about there, that, as I say, really comes through in the book. And I think is one of the things that's potentially difficult when I was reading through and I was thinking, actually, do you know what? How have I got to the point that I am in my working? What support did I have? And, in the introduction chapter, you talk about 10 challenges of working with TAs and why they're no one's fault. And part of that is around and the importance of your book, I think, is what sort of training and expectations exist around support staff. And what are your opinions on sort of how much we get through our teacher training or early career around what's expected of us with support staff and how we deal with them?
I think there's very, very little. And one of the reasons for writing the book was it came out of conversations with early career teachers, newly qualified teachers, as they were when I was first having the conversation about, they were put in this classroom with these adults and told, there was no training. They were expected to deal with it. And, I found myself increasingly being involved with conversations with early career teachers, particularly, but actually with teachers across the board, saying, how do I work with the adults? How do I get... Sometimes it's put in the frame of how do I get the adults to do what I want? Or how do I explain to the adults what I want? How do I learn from them? And I felt particularly when I was talking to some very young teachers, who were saying, I'm in this room with one or more adults who have more experience than me, are older than me, have been at the school longer than me, know the children better than me, and I'm the one with the planning and supposed to be have some direction and ownership of what the class happens in the classroom. I'm being the one where the buck stops, but I haven't got any control over that. How do I make that work? And I looked at and thought, well, there must be something out there. And there's the excellent academic, great work from the MITRE project taken into the Education Endowment Foundation materials. I found shelves of books on how to be a good TA. The MITRE stuff was aimed at school leaders. These lots of books for TAs on how to be a good TA, but for the teachers themselves, there just seemed to be a complete void of information and guidance. And that, if you're trying to pitch a book to a publisher, great to be able to say, actually, there's nothing written on this. And there was nothing written on it. And so that was sort of the motivation behind the book, which came from those kind of conversations.
Yeah, and I think you're right. When I looked through it, I hadn't read a book like this before. I hadn't received training, or I'd received advice. I think is probably better than training. From colleagues, from Senkos, sort of about how to deploy staff and things like that. I'd had that sort of informal advice, but I hadn't ever received formal training. I certainly hadn't had advice or a book or any sort of guidance or reports in that sense to support me as the classroom teacher in what I should be doing with the adult. Now, I wanted to ask as well just about the sort of the context of the book and as you were writing it, but the full 10 challenges you mentioned in that kind of introduction chapter were the assumption that if you can manage children, you can manage adults. The role of the TA has developed by stealth. And I want to pick your brains on that maybe a little bit later because I'm really interested in that. The role of the TA is not clear. Confusion between the teacher and TA. Lack of job security. And it does get mentioned somewhere in there that 15% of schools' budgets in 2020 is spent on teaching assistants. Who becomes a TA and why, a lack of training, issues of time, questions of preparedness, deployment and practice, and using TAs to promote inclusion. And we'll go through a lot of these topics, but I think some of those jumped out to me as being incredibly pertinent to sort of current school funding issues, particularly when schools might be looking to reduce staff costs by reducing staff. And particularly in a kind of post-COVID catch-up approach where we might be deploying our staff slightly differently. Did you have those kind of pressures sort of in mind that, people might be using TAs differently because of financial pressures or might even be losing them entirely when you were writing the book?
Yes. I was aware of both. And I think this is why if we're going, I think TAs are a vital part of the school staff, but they are, as you say, an expensive resource. We use a lot of primary schools use a lot of their budget on TAs, and they need to be doing it well. And I think also with the recruitment, the retention of TAs, having the money to finance them, we can only justify that if we're doing it well. I would actually, I would, as you're talking, I'm going back to many years ago. I did a review of TA deployment in a primary school, and I, got in, and the head teacher took me around the school, and was pointing out the TAs in the classroom, and I said to him, what are they doing? They're supporting, he said. I said, yes. And what are they doing to support? Support. Yes, but what do they do? What does the support look like? How? And it became very quickly clear, presumably why I've been asked to go in and do the piece of work, he had no idea what this group of his staff were actually doing. He knew they were supporting children, but he didn't know how they were supporting children. He didn't know what they were doing. And I think that it's having that question, and this is one, what is it that we want our TAs to do? If we're going to use them effectively, if we're going to get value for money, if we're going to make a difference to children's learning, we need to be able to actually train, support our staff and share up the planning with them. We're not winging it. Because none of us do our best work when we're winging it, yet that's what we ask of an awful lot of TAs in an awful lot of schools every single day.
Just jump in there when you say about the winging it as well, is we're talking specifically about primary schools as well, where we're talking about support across the whole range of subjects, which, that kind of curriculum knowledge for teaching staff is something that people are concerned about at the moment with the focus on curriculum at the moment. So that must be incredibly difficult for teaching assistants as well, even if they are incredibly experienced.
And I think I say primary because the book is written and described as being for primary. I hope it's got an awful lot for secondary, and I hope it's not exclusive for primary. And I know it's not. One of the pre-reviewers was Kenny Wheeler, who has a secondary background, and he's going, yeah, you need this in secondary. But some of the deployment issues and the communication issues are even more complex at secondary. But this key thing about staff not winging it, staff having the knowledge, the understanding. And, you talk about COVID catch-up. I'm really aware of the huge change in the way reading and phonics are being taught. And these impact and are really important for staff training. And, we're struggling with teachers, as you say, having the knowledge. And we've got, TAs, particularly, this issue, if they arrive with the children, they never see the planning, and then they're being asked to differentiate, support learning for what, year 6 maths, particular methods for maths, phonics. Unless they have that training, that support, we're not going to make effective use of them. They're not going to be able to do the job as well as they could. And I think it's really important, and that we actually put time and money, dare I say it, into actually training not only our teachers but also training. There's still simply 3 elements. We need to train our teachers. We need to train our staff, our TA support staff. We need to train them to work together. And one of the things I feel very strongly is that the more staff training we can do jointly with teachers and TAs, the stronger schools will be, and the greater the impact will be for children. Because otherwise, one group's training the other, and messages are getting lost in translation, or they've simply not got time to share them.
Sort of part of what we've talked about there, and part of this staff training thing, and part of, I guess, how things have changed over time is when I started, you've talked about staff training, teaching assistants turned up, and people's hours were, they turned up, they started in class. Sometimes as the class was coming in, there wasn't a lot of time for prep. They left at the end of the day. Are we changing already to provide the training and that support so teachers can talk to staff before they start the lesson?
I would love to think so, but I don't think realistically it's happening. And I'm seeing a sort of maximum of maybe 15, 30 minutes either end of the day, 30 minutes at the outside. I'm seeing some schools who are giving TAs some planning time, but on the whole, teaching, it's a budget issue. Schools know it should be happening, but they haven't got the money. It's also a really practical issue that so many of the TAs are also parents in the school, in a lot of schools, and they haven't got the childcare and they can't afford the childcare. So they're coming in with the children because that's how it works for them to manage their own lives, and they're going out with the children, or the children are sitting round in the classroom after school, which again doesn't necessarily support liaison. Which is why I'm trying to look at ways of getting the planning down to an absolute minimum as we can, sharing and finding a shortcut to it.
We talk about the parents supporting those roles that maybe have developed from having adult, parent helpers in class. Do you think the kind of people who are being teaching assistants, or why people want to be teaching assistants, has changed over time as well? I know that's one of the 10 things you mentioned at the start.
Yes and no is the answer. I mean, historically, the teaching assistants were senior pupils, in Victoria model. Then over the 20th century, certainly into the beginning of my teaching career, there were very few teaching assistants. There were few ancillary staff who basically dealt with liquids, blood, vomit, urine and coffee. Not mixed, hopefully. And occasionally could come in to hear readers, come in to help with art lessons. So at the beginning of my career, when it used to need to allow most of the day for the computer to load up, I used to have a parent who came and supervised the computer. But as we got the change in the number of children with special needs in school, as we got the concerns about teacher workload and retention, And as we got the introduction of the national curriculum and Ofsted, we then started getting more support staff who were directly being involved within the classroom. And over time, the expectations of those staff have moved from people who wash paint pots to people who are absolutely, you talked about assistant teachers, and they are having a pedagogic role and a teaching role. But in many schools, particularly in primary schools, the people who are applying for the jobs as TAs, LSAs, are in fact parents at school. Overwhelmingly, the TA workforce remains female. Overwhelmingly, people start as parents. A lot stay if they like the job and it's well supported. The other group I find, in my experience, is people who are looking to go into teacher training, who come and are a teaching assistant from a year, a couple of years, and then go use it to gain the experience in schools and check whether they want to be a teacher. But they're not. The workforce. I'm not sure the actual people in it have changed, but the expectations that's made of them has changed hugely.
Yeah, and that is certainly something that I've noticed. The way that we talk about using teaching assistants, the way that we use them, and I really like your word about how it's changed by stealth. Because it hasn't been something that I've ever really seen as consulted on. It's been gradual changes over time. We're going to take this new approach here. We're going to try this little bit here. It's just kind of happened over time that it has significantly changed since when I first started teaching, definitely sort of 15 years ago.
I started first. I started in 1986. So I began my teacher training, and it took me to teaching in the early 90s to have teaching assistants doing what we would now recognise as a teaching assistant role in my classroom. And people but nobody sat down and said, actually, we need a paraprofessional workforce. If we look at paraprofessionals in health, in social care, in the legal profession, there was a clear model developed of the person with the professional qualification supported by someone who still has qualification at a lower level. So you have in a hospital you have doctors and nurses. You also have healthcare professionals who are working, doing often some very complex care roles, but not with the same training as the other medical professionals. And you see it in social work with social workers and family support workers. You see it, in legal terms, solicitors and paralegals. In each of those cases, there's been much more thought to the career structure. In the teaching assistant, there is no career structure. There's not even a requirement for them to have line management or appraisal.
Oh, wow.
There were no standards. There was an attempt to introduce standards for teaching assistants, but it was never followed through.
I did not realise that.
So I'm aware I'm getting slightly. I think it's 2000. No, I'm gonna have to 2009-10, and I'm gonna have to check the date. It's when we have the advert break. That we had all the attempts at the government and the unions agreed to standards for teaching assistants, but they were never made statutory, and so there is no requirement. It's something the government's Green Paper and SEN Improvement Plan has said is going to come in, but we had the opportunity to do it. It wasn't done, and that I think is a really difficult element for because teaching assistants are required and expected to do such different things in different schools, because is no consistency of what's expected of them.
And that must make it incredibly hard then for staff moving between, not just new staff starting, but if you're moving as an experienced member of staff from one school to a different school with a different approach to how they're going to use their support staff.
Entirely. And it's really hard because there is no consistency. And I became very aware when going into a different school as a senior leader, the expectations was completely different. It's a really difficult issue for, there is this complete lack of consistency. Each school is, in effect, making it up as they go along, as yet another element of how does this role how does this role work, and how does it work for in different schools?
Really, as I say, I found it really interesting thinking about this book. Now, we are going to hear from an organisation that help us out here at Teachers Talk Radio. So some important messages coming up.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, a leading publisher of books, directories, educational guides and magazines specifically aimed at forward-thinking schools in the UK and beyond. Have you checked out their latest releases? Don't miss out! Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading!
Live from Swansea, this is The Twilight Show with Nathan Gynn on Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Boridar Pab, Croeso Abertawe, hello and welcome to Swansea Twilight Show with me, Nathan Gynn, on Teachers Talk Radio. We're joined by Sarah Alston, talking about working effectively with your teaching assistant, particularly a handbook for primary teachers. Sarah, welcome back.
Just very quickly, the date of the teachers assistant standards that were never made statutory is 2016.
Oh, thank you for that was a very quick fact check for us in between sort of the ad break just there. So thanks for updating us. Now, I wanted to ask you just some sort of technical questions. I did say when we were sort of talking earlier about the structure of the book, and so I had a feeling I really enjoyed when I was reading through the book of this kind of staff meeting or training. It felt like more than one voice, this kind of insightful explanation, and then case study examples, personal stories. I really like this part where there's examples of this isn't working, try this. Was that sort of a deliberate choice when you were writing the book that you were structuring it in that way?
Yes, because I wanted it to feel user-friendly. Didn't want a great long text. I wanted it to be something that people could dip into, was broken up, and I found the inclusive classroom, which I wrote with Daniel Sabell, we had a version of the "if this doesn't work, try this," and people came back and said we really like this. So I thought, hang on, I got something that works. Be stupid to not try it again. And I just think it gives people an opportunity to think, yeah, okay. It's when staff come to me and they say, oh, I got this this isn't working. And I then say, well, what could you do differently? And I think it's very easy for us to get very negative. And, for teachers say, well, this isn't working for me. This child keeps shouting out. Well, what can I, I tried this. Well, what else can I try? And I suppose it's also a way of offering two things people might try, sort of in a very quick bit. And it makes it real. It's about real people. All the stories are fictionalised, but, I've met people. I've been working in schools a long time. They are not entirely, they're based in school experiences. And it's a way of sharing what works and giving examples without going, have you tried this? Have you tried this? the alternative is gets a long list of try this, try this, try this, try this. And I did talk briefly at one point. The publisher said, well, did I want to almost do like flow charts of if you tried this, try that. And then we thought it just didn't work. So no, I really wanted something that people could dip in and out of. I'm hoping this will be a book, people will have and they go, oh, I'm having a bit of a problem with that. I want to make this work better. I can dip in. We don't have a lot of time as teachers to read, so I don't, it'd be lovely to think people are going to read it all the way through, but what I really want is things they can dip it in and out. That's why we sort of finish each chapter with some key points and some things to discuss with senior leaders and things to think about and some things that have worked really well. And then if people can look at that, they can look through at these bits and then go, yeah, this chapter's got what I want in it, and go and dive in deeper, hopefully.
Yeah, I definitely went that way. I found it so like a strange kind of supportiveness of feeling that there were other people on this journey with me making these changes, were, maybe not getting it right, and then finding a way to improve as well from those kind of anecdotes and personal stories.
Yeah, I've been a Senko since 2008, so I've spoken to a lot of staff. In my role as consultant and trainer, I go into a lot of schools. I want people to come out of conversations having something practical they can do. Not, this is not an academic book. It's a practical, the reason we said a handbook, because, this is handbook of strategies. And some of them will work, and some of them may not work the first time, but they work the second time. And some of them may work with one class, but not another year. Or work one year, not the next, because the children and the staff will be different. You need to have an armoury of strategies you can try, because people and circumstances change.
Now, I wanted to ask about the first chapter of the book is about understanding what you want your TA to do in the classroom. And there's so much in it that I related to, though, for those that don't work in primary, you can be a new teacher or new to a year group placed with a very experienced TA, or the other way round too. I've been stuck in my ways with an unspoken routine with a TA who I knew really well. And then we've had a change of support staff, and it's really thrown me. So I wanted to ask you, when setting up those classroom roles for each other, what are the key things that people should be thinking about?
Well, I think it's about not making, a lot of it's going to be about not assuming people can mind read. I think in the end of the book, I say, if I could summarise the book in a single sentence, talk to each other. Don't assume that people know. It's very easy when, the classic one is, I see it again and again, either the teacher or the TA has had some bit of training and they go in full of enthusiasm to implement it, but they forget to explain to the other what it is they're doing or why they're doing it. Or, when I had, the speech and language therapist has come in and has talked to somebody in the classroom, and then they go in, but they don't share. And I think it's about talking, and the other bit about talking is listening. It's very easy for either the teacher or the TA to give their view, but not to hear what the other one's saying. I think the key thing is about also being explicit. I very often find I've got staff coming and complaining to me that other people are not doing something. And I often end up with the question is, have you asked them to do it? Have you told them that'd be useful? And then, then there's a silence, and you seem thinking, no. Well, why don't we start with a discussion about what you actually want them to do?
You also talk about, in the book, I'm not sure if it's in that chapter or later on, about recognising the skill set that different people bring to the classroom. And, for those who aren't primary teachers, who are listening in maybe from a different perspective, is, I could be there as an amazing artist myself, but have a teaching assistant, and I have previously, who spoke Spanish and was Spanish far better than me. Or I've worked with a teaching assistant who was a football coach. And so, there are those different skills that different people bring.
I think that's absolutely absolutely key. And I always go back to my amazing teaching assistant who I worked with for many years. Is a lovely lady, name checker, Wendy Howells, who used to just laugh at the thought that I might teach music. She's very musical. I am possibly the most tone-deaf, unmusical person on the planet. It became absolutely clear that Wendy should lead the music. I planned the music lessons because I knew what we needed to teach, but she led them because she had the skills. Music of all things is really hard to teach if you're very unmusical. But by being able to work together, as you can probably hear, I'm a southerner. I'm born in South London, raised in South London. She came from Manchester. When we were teaching phonics, being able to hear them both from the different voices was absolutely vital. Because they actually could hear how the sound was different, and that was key as well. So there was a lot, and so much about recognising those skills. I think, and also if you want to make your staff feel valued, use their skills. If we don't recognise, and one of the things, you won't know what your staff's skills are if you don't ask.
Fantastic. Now, I wanted to ask you as well, we're talking about roles, so talking about those things. I wanted to ask you, talk in the book a bit about this change in expectations of SEND, particularly, those changes of what how we approach things in mainstream settings now, particularly. But also, you give a nickname of a Velcro TA and the difference between being a helicopter instead. Can you just explain maybe like a little bit more detail for someone who hasn't heard that analogy before?
Okay, so very often we have been with special needs, particularly when a child gets an EHCP, they come particularly in the local authorities where support is given by hours. Local authorities are trying to move away from this, and who knows what the SEN improvement plan will give us in the future. But at the moment, there is an expectation among staff, senior leaders, parents, and even children. If you have an EHCP, you have a TA. Now, the majority of children do, very few of us go into adulthood with another adult with us all the time. We need to give children opportunities for independence. With the sort of expectation of the one-to-one, we get the Velcro TA, the TA who is there with the child all the time. And then the child doesn't get the opportunity to be independent. They don't get the chance to do things for themselves. And we impacts our expectation that the child can do anything for themselves. And you get the children who go, I can't do anything because Miss So-and-so's not here today. And I can't do anything because they're not here. And all the knowledge of the child goes to the TA. They work with the TA, so they don't get teacher time. So that's your Velcro TA. It's not a great approach. Much better, in my view, is a helicopter. We're saying that you may have a key person who gives a child that safe contact person, maybe gives the parent the safe contact person. But they start the child off. Like the helicopter, they start on the ground level. They check the child knows what to do. They maybe give them a prompted start, maybe help them find the resources, maybe give them the resources depending on the child's needs. They then, as a helicopter, they lift off. They can circle, they can watch and observe. They can probably work with some other children at the same time. They come back to their key child. They check they're okay. They encourage. They say, well done, that's great. They check they know what they're doing. They check they know what to do next. Lift off, circle, drop down. So the support is as and when they need it. It is not there when they don't need it. And when they don't need it, the TA can work with other children. It builds the confidence of the children. Disadvantages, we don't always get it right, and we may get the timing wrong. But actually that's a learning opportunity both for us and the child as well. So I think it's, my experience is it's a much better approach. I have had some children with very significant physical needs in mainstream classrooms who do need somebody with them all the time. But even those children need some opportunities to be independent. I've also had children where there have been significant safeguarding concerns who need somebody with eyes on them at all times. That doesn't need someone glued to them at all times. Does that make it clearer what I'm talking about?
Yeah, it does, and I it's something that I recognise, and I've moved to different schools where, it might shock you to hear, or it might not in some senses, that, I arrived at one school and there had been a big change of leadership. So we didn't know a lot about what had happened. And it was our first parents' evening. And I was asked why the teaching assistants weren't coming to parents' evening to talk about the SEND students. And that really shocked me, because I said, well, surely the teacher can talk about them. And there had been kind of this complete split between whose responsibility to an extreme, and that was the most extreme example of that kind of Velcro approach that I'd seen.
So it's about if you have that approach, the child is actually excluded from teacher time. That becomes exclusion masquerading as inclusion, because the child is actually being excluded from their entitlement to quality first teaching, and the TA becomes a barrier between the child and the teacher. And I've also seen TAs who are there all the time become a barrier between the child and their peers, because they have a TA with them all the time, so they never get to have the relationship with their peers. I went into one school doing a deployment review, and first 3 classrooms, I was able to tell the head teacher, I could identify the children with special needs. The man thought I was a genius. I took him back and showed him what I was seeing. And what I'm seeing was in each of those classrooms, I could spot the special needs children because they were sat with an adult between them and their peers. And they were actually being separated. And that is not inclusion, that's exclusion.
Yeah, certainly. Now, I wanted to ask, just to move on, so I should say this isn't something I mentioned earlier, but the chapters start with quotes, and I really like that. Or that, very early on in each chapter, there's this quote, and I wanted to read one to you and just get your thoughts on it. This first one, it says, I want to be able to support children from the beginning to the end of the lesson. If I can support them in the first 5 minutes, so they feel confident, then the rest just works. And that's from a TA. Now, you've talked a little bit about that movement already with the helicopter teaching, but how do we get to this point where TAs can support throughout the whole of the lesson? And also, how does that role of the TA then look at different points in the lesson?
I think the first thing is we need them in the room. That means we need to be clear that they are not off doing the photocopying, having their break, running an intervention group. They're in the room throughout the lesson, because they can't support anything when they're not in the room. And again, this approach sort of goes back to the inclusive classroom book I wrote with Daniel Sabel, and he and I looked at that with inclusion and inclusive strategies in 5 phases of the lesson. And I took that thought and thought, one of the things I've been aware when we wrote that book was we didn't talk about TAs, and we didn't talk about TAs' roles in inclusion. So I wanted to take this opportunity to look at, what did we get? What was it useful for TAs to do? From that meeting and greeting as children come in, that key bit of making children feel wanted, valued, and included in the classroom, and assessing, are they ready to learn, and being able to respond to that. Things like setting up the visual timetables, maybe some pre-teaching, making sure the children have the resources. Then supporting children to sort of understand the instructions and the input. This is very often a point when TAs are sent off to do something else, which means for those who are not getting to see the planning, they don't know what they're supposed to do at the next point when they're supporting individuals. But also they're not, if we can support children to access the instructions, they have a greater chance of being able to follow them independently. It sounds, so actually modelling that engagement, supporting children, being able to use the pre-teaching they've been doing to ensure that children have the vocabulary to access that bit. Then supporting children in that bit where they're working as individuals. And I mean, one of the key things, I talked about prompted starts, being able to enable children to focus on the learning, not the admin of the lesson. I know as a Senko, I have often looked at books and all children have written in it is the data and the learning intention again and again, because that takes all their academic, emotional, learning energy, and they never get to the learning. They just do the admin again and again and again. So, one of the things I think for TAs is simply write the date. I know it sounds really, it's simple, but also making sure that the children have the right resources. They support that, how children record. And I mean, I passionately believe we should be encouraging children to show their own learning and to record independently where possible, and support of IT, recognising that writing is not the only way of showing learning. But that's it. But sometimes a child will dictate a sentence, have a sentence scribed for them so that we get the core of their learning. They actually share what they know. And I think, a TA role there, the whole thing of using IT effectively needs a lot of support. Supporting children also to talk about that metacognition, what do I need to do? That scaffolding. Scaffolding is one of those words we use an awful lot in education, but without, can you just scaffold that? Well, what do you want them to do? And understanding that, what do you need to do next question? How do we support children? So we're actually supporting the learning, not the task completion.
I find it incredibly interesting when you talk about that difference between supporting work completion and task completion and supporting the learning. It's something that I've seen many times, and something that is often needed to be addressed. I think it is a conversation that needs to be had with all staff in the room about what we want to get out of the lesson, isn't it? What is the point of the lesson? Is the lesson to complete the worksheet, or is the lesson to do the learning?
And you can only spot which is which if you know what the learning intention is. It goes back to sharing the planning and having the subject knowledge, because if you don't know what it is the child should be learning, or how to tell if they learnt it, you're going to return to task completion. I'm just going to say then, supporting with group work. And the other thing I think really important, is the last 5 minutes of that lesson, and the role of getting that modelling, supporting the children to maintain their focus, is supporting children to finish learning, to evaluate, and to make those transitions safely. Because so often that last 5 minutes just gets rushed, and children, find it stressful, which means to then find the first five minutes, or indeed the whole of the next lesson, stressful, because they've finished the last one in the stress. And the role of TAs to make sure those transitions are calm. So, I think TAs need to be, if we get it right in the first 5 minutes, it works. But the more we've got the TA involved throughout the lesson, the more they are able to be effective. But they need to know what they're doing.
Yeah, certainly. So, so complicated. As I say, it's so useful for me reading through the book and thinking about it, that aiding my thought process. And also, as I say, reading those examples of how it works and hearing from different voices, I found really powerful in the book as a way of helping me personally sort of take it on board. It didn't feel dictated to me in that sense. I really enjoyed reading the book. I felt it a kind of process of growth for myself as well. So I think, as I say, I can be more complimentary about that style.
Well, thank you. No, because I want it to feel like a conversation. Only I can't actually be with each reader. I want to feel that at least part of a conversation, and they can take some bits. And if they want to shout at me, I'm available on social media. Please do.
Wonderful. Well, phone, I should say, because as I say, I found it incredibly useful. And, as, particularly, and I'm someone who has or should be saying, I should be saying I've got loads of experience in this, but I think you're right about the different people. There's people and different skills they bring in, how those different people work together. There's so much to it that is worth going back to again and again. And I do feel like that with the book, it's something that I will go back to again, and maybe as new staff come or people become more experienced or the children I'm working with change, it's something that I would go back to and look at again and again. Now we are going to pop to the news. The conversation is going to continue after the news, so if you're listening with us now, stay with us, because you can text us in. If you're listening in the Podbean app, you can tweet us at TT Radio Official. We can be looking into that, how to work effectively with your teaching assistant, and join us on the other side.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, a leading publisher of books, directories, educational guides and magazines specifically aimed at forward-thinking schools in the UK and beyond. Have you checked out their latest releases? Don't miss out! Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading!
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
During his visit to Northern Ireland, US President Joe Biden suggested in a speech at Ulster University that students are increasingly persuaded to stay at home rather than seek careers abroad. The speech, reported in the Belfast Telegraph, refers to young people, instead of fleeing for opportunities elsewhere, can see their futures and careers for themselves that speak to unlimited possibilities here. However, the article goes on to feature comments from Anne Watt, Director of Political Research Group Pivotal, who says that whilst she welcomed the positive nature of the comments, Northern Ireland still has a long way to go before the battle to keep the most promising students can be won. She went on to say there is evidence in her organisation's research that significant economic migration could be worsening, not improving. The problem of young people leaving Northern Ireland to study elsewhere and not returning has been around for years, and many seem to see the President's words as aspirational rather than accurate. Ms Watts also raised the point that as students leave Northern Ireland, other students from the UK and further afield are not coming in the same numbers. The country, therefore, cannot retain or regain talent, and political instability has not helped matters. In order for Northern Ireland to meet the aspirations raised in Biden's speech, talent needs to stay at home. The Daily Mirror reports on figures released by the Department for Education, which show more than 140,000 school children were severely absent in the summer of 2022. The paper refers to these young people as ghost children, and raises concerns that this pattern is continuing in the current academic year. The Department for Education says the term severely absent refers to children of school age who are not receiving a suitable education either with a teacher or homeschooling. They are usually those with attendance below 50%. The reasons for being away from school include anxiety, mental health, special educational needs and disabilities, but concerns arise around young people who are likely extremely vulnerable. Last year, the Children's Commissioner also released a report focusing on school attendance, but, according to DfE figures, attendance to schools across England has largely failed to recover to pre-pandemic levels. Latest figures released by the DfE has persistent absence at 22.4%. These are pupils with below 90% attendance, although this is suggested as being a result of illness towards the end of the autumn term. According to FE Week, the Department for Education has launched a £1 million contract for an organisation to drive new T-level employment placements. The documents explain that the DfE is seeking a potential supplier to engage with employers to develop their knowledge and understanding of T-levels, as well as helping them to plan and prepare to deliver high-quality industry placements. T-level courses were first launched in 2020 and feature a mandatory placement with an employer totalling 45 days or 315 hours. There are now 16 T-levels available, with another 2 due to launch this September. As the provision of the qualifications has grown, so has the need for placements. The DfE has offered financial support to employers offering placements, but uptake has not been high, as employers cite red tape and cost pressures as reasons the courses are unattractive. Finally, as the row over teacher pay and conditions as well as concern over recruitment continues, the Evening Standard featured a report on Londoners turning their back on teaching and flocking to better paid jobs in the city. A combination of the availability of better paid jobs and the high cost of living in the capital is putting Londoners off teaching, according to school leaders. Whilst a DfE spokesperson spoke about the bursaries and scholarships on offer for those training in key subjects such as maths, physics and computing, many took to social media to highlight the issues facing teachers in the capital, such as the difficulty in buying or renting property, when the average teacher salary in inner London is £47,000, but the average property price is over £600,000. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
This is 2 Minute Tech with Steve Woods, your tech briefing on Teachers Talk Radio.
Hello, this week I'm going to talk about hidden spy cameras. Do you know who is filming you? Modern cameras can be as small as a pinhead and embedded in things like pens, buttons, and while researching this, I even found one built into the centre of a crosshead screw. Online shopping sites blatantly sell spying devices such as smoke alarms with built-in spy cameras. There have been high-profile cases in the media of people misusing spy cameras, but as I investigated further, one statistic stood out. 11% of people that use Airbnb reported finding hidden cameras. As I continue to dig around for a UK statistic, the figure dropped to 10%. That's 1 in 10 people. Now, obviously, this is not solely limited to Airbnb. They just seem to be the company that has the most media coverage. So, for those of you that are concerned, my next investigation was how to detect a hidden camera. Here are the top pieces of advice I've found. You can buy devices that are designed to detect cameras. They start at about £40 and utilise most of the other methods I'm about to talk about. You can buy an app for your phone. If worried, don't buy it before you go. Some apps have a free trial period. Use that to scan the areas you're concerned with. Visual checks. Look for items that seem out of place. A clock pointing at the bed. A random USB dongle in a wall socket. Shine your phone torch at suspected items. Camera lenses will light up, helping you identify them. In the dark, a lot of cameras will use infrared to continue to get pictures. This can be seen via your phone camera. Look through your phone around the room in the dark and watch for suspicious dots of light. Please remember, if we turn this statistic around, 9 out of 10 places are not covertly trying to film you, and that statistic was good enough for very popular cat food in the past. As always, if you have a tech question, why not send it to @TTRadioOfficial. I'm Steve Woods, and that was 2 Minute Tech.
2 Minute Tech with Steve Woods, your tech briefing on Teachers Talk Radio. Live from Swansea, this is the Twilight Show with Nathan Gynn on Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Borodar Pab, Croeso Abatawi. Hello everyone, welcome to Swansea, the Twilight Show. We Teachers Talk Radio. Tonight we're joined by Sarah Alston, author of Working Effectively with Your Teaching Assistant. If you've just joined us, we've been talking about this wonderful book from Bloomsbury Education and all of the useful advice in there. We are joined by the author, so welcome back, Sarah.
Thank you for having me back. I'm really enjoying the Welsh, by the way. It's lovely just hearing.
Do you know what? It sounds a little bit odd because it's like Danny Dyer does Welsh, unfortunately, because of my birth accent, should I say, compared to my adopted accent, are slightly different, and so sometimes the pronunciation doesn't get off. But it is a really interesting topic at the moment in the news with the reclamation of the Welsh language, particularly with some of the mountain ranges here. It's causing a bit of a fuss at the moment, but I'm very passionate about your locale, where you live, being a part of it. I think that's important, and I think that's the primary school teacher in me. That being part of a community is something that I really love. So I am trying. I'm trying my best.
Well, I'm enjoying it, and I would give if it wasn't getting too off topic, a quick shout out to the wonderful production of Midsummer's Night's Dream at the Sherman Theatre that was in Cardiff last year, where all those who were magical or could enchant people or spoke Welsh. Those who were not enchanted or enchantable spoke English.
Well, you know, it is
Along the proscenium arch, a
that.
production.
Wow, you know, I'm going to have to look that up because, you know, it is a mythical and magical language. Over Easter, I popped down to see what's King Arthur's Labyrinth with my boys, where we went underground and, you know, heard the legends from the Mabinogion, and some of them are a bit out there. You know, there's giants, there's talking heads, there's things, but, you know, it is a magical and mythical language. But we digress. We're talking about tonight teaching assistants and how to use support staff effectively. Now, one of the things that really jumped at me, and something that I hadn't talked about, because I know we've talked about some of, you know, how we use them in lesson time, and you know, the training and support and the communication and the definition of roles. But one of the things that jumped out at me was chapter 3, and it was about supporting home communication, and it was something that I hadn't really thought about before, and definitely something that I want to implement more of. So, you know, in your mind, what are the positives of the TA supporting you in this way, and maybe what are some of the pitfalls?
I think the important is often, I think we need it because they're somebody different. They have a less seem to have a less formal role, and particularly for those parents whose own experiences at school have not been brilliant, that a TA is easier to talk to because they're not the teacher. For often there is, you know, scope for TAs to carve out time. They're often more easily available, particularly in the schools where the TA is also running, or TA is also running the breakfast club or the after school club. You know, there's that scope for them. Often they're more embedded within the community. They're often parents, as we already discussed. They may, in a lot of schools, the TAs will speak. We've just been talking about Welsh, but you know how the TAs will speak home community languages, so it will just make that communication easier. And so let's use all the support we have. I mean, I talk about children with special needs having a key person who is that they can relate to, and that both for the child and for the parent. And so I think we don't use our TAs to support homeschool communication. We miss a trick. However, there are disadvantages. We need to make sure the communication is consistent. And if we don't share the planning, they don't understand the learning, the communication may be inconsistent. There will be those parents who end up, you know, almost playing off the TA, the teacher, and the different relationship. So we need those messages to be really consistent. And that means the TA and the teacher need to talk to each other, and they need to share when they talk to the parents and what they're talked about and what they're said, so that the communication is consistent and clear. We also need to be aware that the TA doesn't become a substitute for the teacher. We were already saying about, well, the TA should have come to that expectation in the school. You were saying the TA came to the parents' evening to talk about the special needs children. We need to make sure that it's a shared ownership, but it's a resource we got in school, and I think we should not. If we don't use it, we miss a trick. But we need to make sure the boundaries are clear, the confidentiality is clear. We haven't got our TAs being hijacked in the supermarket, being expected to give things, opinions about school, and them knowing that even if they are, they just have to say, that's me wearing my school hat, not my buying my sausages hat, and they need to not, that sort of conversation I'm having in this place. But given those boundaries, pick a resource, use it.
Yeah, definitely. It's something that I think is really simple, but so effective, and not something that I'd necessarily thought about clearly or had a kind of clear line of thought. One of my concerns. Sorry, go on.
You're saying about skills audit, checking what languages your staff speak, because we get growing numbers of children with English and additional language in our schools, and finding actually that your member staff, you said that you had a TA who spoke Spanish, But knowing what languages your staff speak is really important, because translators are not a cheap resource.
No, and I also think, sometimes, in the book you do talk about like sort of the different roles and responsibilities of different people, and where there is a space for additional language support, and I think that truly is a thing. But also, I think if it's external to the school, sometimes it feels like a separate part. When it's part of the school, and that is something I love about that community element of the school, being part of it, and someone in the school speaks your language. I think that's so much more powerful.
And just something to support those, somebody who speaks your language. But also, it's not only speaks your language as in having the language. Particularly when I'm working with a number of parents whose origin is in Eastern Europe. Their English is excellent. In some cases, I suspect rather better than mine. But what they don't have is the understanding of the British education system and what the expectations of schools and children are, and particularly how special needs is viewed within the education system. So it's not only talking your language as in the actual words, it's talking a language as in the understanding of the culture.
Now, one of the things I wanted to ask you about, and it's not something that I feel comes through in the book, but it is something that I've heard, and it relating to teaching assistants, and it relates back to that idea of the role. Do you have any concerns that maybe teaching assistants might be being taken advantage of by that role shift, that role evolution that we're seeing, that we are sometimes asking too much of them for their pay bracket, for want of a better word?
Absolutely. We're asking, and it's both the pay bracket and it's the training. We're asking people to do things without providing them with the training, without providing with the pay, without providing them with the hours. I keep referring to the need to share planning, and I talk about sharing planning with 3 questions, and it fitting on a post-it. Of the key information that people need to be able to know what's happening in a lesson. But the number of times I have heard, it's on the planning's on the system. The TA, we're then expecting the TA to access the system and look at the planning in their own time. Well, if they're not being paid, and most of them are being paid pretty near minimum wage, term time only, often not being paid for their breaks. To then be asking them at home to look at it. A lot of them don't have the IT capacity, the time, the space to do that. That isn't fair, and it's not appropriate. And we because there's so much, there isn't enough money, there isn't enough training, there isn't enough time in the system. And because so often TAs and teachers form such close relationships, we actually end up relying on the friendship of the TA and the teacher, and the desire and professionalism from both to give the absolute best to the children in their care. We end up building a system on the expectation that TAs are going to do more than they're paid for. And then, when you have a TA and a teacher who don't get on, the system falls apart because it's dependent on goodwill. And that's lovely, but we shouldn't have a system that depends on TAs being able to give being willing and able to give extra time. We should be paying them, because when we pay them, when we give them the support to work effectively, they make such a difference to the learning of our children.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And as I say, it's not something that I feel comes through in the book, but it is something that I think people, would be aware of or thinking about. And certainly, I have been a teaching assistant myself, and it's something that I was aware of. We've talked about those different routes as people come through, because some people might have those aspirations to go on to train to be a teacher, and might be wanting to take more on. But some people might want to be a very high quality teaching assistant, and that is their goal. That is okay too.
And I think there's it's the whole thing of how often do we encourage our very best teachers out of the classroom and into leadership, which may not be their skill set? We don't put enough celebration on first class practice in the classroom, first class classroom practice. We don't, I mean, it was Kenny Beganar when she was standing for Conservative Party leader, who described TAs as surplus staff.
Ouch.
Our present Secretary of State, who talked about TAs basically training to do something better. This whole disrespect for TAs, I mean, I don't get into it in the book, A, because it's political and time bonded, B, because, I want this to be a practical classroom book, not a political rant. But we need to value our TAs, and only by valuing our TAs will we actually create an effective workforce which makes a difference for our children.
Now, I have to say I do agree. I think it does. It upsets me and it frustrates me when people talk about some of those things about this kind of expectation that you should be wanting to become a teacher rather than doing something that you are very good at. I think there is a difference between upskilling people to be even a better version of themselves and moving on to do something perceived as a better job. And I've seen that work so wonderfully with teaching assistants, giving them the skills to do what they do even better.
And I think also the other group I get very concerned about is teaching assistants who've been in the job a very long time and were employed to do one thing, but are now being expected to do something entirely different to what they were originally employed for, and then being penalised when they haven't developed the skills that they don't, because they were never given the training, or that wasn't what they signed up to do, and they would never have signed up to do a job which involved running a maths or a phonics group. They signed up to do a job which required doing something entirely different. And I think sometimes we need to stop and say, what is actually on the teaching assistant's job description? And is this something, and the job description when they join the school, not the job description that the person who most recently has joined the school has. So does that make sense?
Really does. But I think it's part of what I think is, the longevity of this book on my bookshelf will be the fact that, staff change. I could have a new teacher come in who has a different approach or a different way of looking at things. I could have a new teaching assistant join me. I could move to a different year group or have, a different cohort of kids start to me. And that is something I definitely felt reading through, that I would go back to this then as all of those things change. Classrooms change year on year for a number of reasons, and I felt that I could go back.
As well. They change within the year because the children mature, and my base school, we're a military school. We have children coming and going, all the time. So actually, it's not just your starting, beginning between years. It's within the year. You need to keep looking and saying, "Have I got this right?" Children change.
Yeah, certainly. Now, I wanted to ask you sort of a final question, because we've talked through so many things, and I would advise people to go out, get this book, because I have already found it so useful, and as I say, the longevity of that for me, that I know I am going to be going back to it and flicking back through and refreshing myself as I go through.
I'm so pleased to hear that. It's really, really, really nice to hear. So thank you.
Now, my final question then is, what one thing could listeners think about in relation to their TAs in their school, while they're waiting for the book to arrive in the post that they've ordered or get to the bookshop, while they're waiting for that, what one thing would you advise that they go to school tomorrow and maybe think about with a fresh pair of eyes?
How do they share the planning with their TAs? I use 3 questions. What's the learning intention? What's the key vocabulary? What's the outcome for that child? And I think and that fits on a post-it. So you can, if the worst comes to worst, you can give them the answer to 3 questions on the post-it, so they know what the lesson's about. I think I think 1 is share the planning, 2 is check have you actually said what you want somebody to do, or are you just assuming they can mind read? Talk to each other and listen to each other, and remember, it's about the children. Yes, that getting to know each other and your relationship is important, but it's a professional relationship, and it's about the support for children and their learning. And if we hold that at the focus of what we're doing, that's going to really help our children. And the more we share the information about them and what the learning is, the better it's going to be.
Fantastic. No, thank you so much. Now, I will say, if you're listening and you haven't caught it yet, I've mentioned it a few times. It's Working Effectively with Your Teaching Assistant, a handbook for primary teachers. It's from Bloomsbury Education, and it has a beautiful. If you're looking for it, red on the bottom, orange in the middle, green on the top, you can't miss it. This book here from Sarah Alston. Thank you so much for joining us and giving up your time this evening just to share some of your thoughts, some of the tips that are included in the book. It's been wonderful to talk to you.
And I'm just going to say, if people want to get in contact, the easiest way is Twitter. I'm at C Inclusion, SEA Inclusion. So please, give me a shout out, let me know what you think, ask questions, get in touch. Also on LinkedIn, Facebook. I feel like saying and all good bookshops, but that's the book. And I've got a website, which is again CSEA Inclusion.
Fantastic. Now, all that leaves to say is, from South Wales, we've talked a little bit. It's Nostar here, so night good, but good night. So I will say, Sarah, Nostar from Swansea here.
Nostar from just outside London in Surrey.
Lovely. We're spreading the language, and that's what I love. All right. Thank you so much. Good night to.
Thank you too.
Good night to all of our listeners. You can continue this conversation at T Radio Official on Twitter if you want to ask more questions, if you want to get involved. And we'll see you soon next time on Teachers Talk Radio. Nostar.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.